All right, we're going to be going over LFOs today. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. In general, an LFO sends a signal and modulates parameters on synth modules based on that signal. In essence, you cannot hear the LFO. You actually do not have a pathway in your signal chain to be able to actually hear the audio coming out of an LFO, but you get to hear the effects of the LFO. Stands for low frequency oscillator, a type of oscillator dedicated to producing low frequency audio signals that are used for controlling and modulating other oscillators or parameters in a synthesizer. So typically, your LFO is not going to be producing anything above 20 hertz. It's only going to be producing frequencies below 20 hertz. Many LFOs allow you to operate above 20 hertz, but you'll start to get some very interesting sounds or harmonics because of the LFO modulating something above 20 hertz, the audible range. It can actually change. It can actually change the pitch of the oscillators or the modules, so it becomes a little bit unusable in music if you're going to be modulating with an LFO above 20 hertz. Like I said before, the output of the LFO is never heard. It's just used to modulate other signals. So there are just a couple main parameters. This will, of course, make more sense when we get into SynthMaster. For just a simple LFO, you are concerned about three main things: the speed of your LFO, so the rate or how, what is the frequency of your LFO, somewhere between 0.1 hertz and 20 hertz typically. And then you have the wave type. So what kind of simple waveform are we using? Sine wave, triangle wave, square wave, etc. And that's going to be perhaps altering the timbre, right? That's the timbre that we're concerned with on your simple waveforms. But remember, we can't actually hear the LFO. So even though you're not hearing it, it can possibly adjust the timbre. Actually, quite literally anything can adjust the timbre with an LFO. And then, of course, you have the volume or the depth of the effect. So you can turn the LFO up, and it makes the LFO be greater in its depth, as in it fluctuates greatly. Or you can have a very small depth, so that it's just kind of making minute changes. So that's speed. So the speed of the LFO, the wave type, so the actual shape of the LFO, sine wave, triangle, etc., and then the volume or the depth. For considerations, you're typically with an LFO modulating volumes, filters, panning, fine tune, but again, you can do whatever you want. The number one rule in music and in synthesis is if it sounds good, it's good, right? So here's a very basic signal flow for your LFO. In this example, the LFO is capable. There's two LFOs. This actually looks quite similar to SynthMaster's signal flow. In this example, it's capable of modulating the oscillator and the filter. Notice how the LFO is output to the oscillator or the filter, but it's actually not output to our amplifier. We can do that in SynthMaster, but in other modules you can't. Perhaps it's a physical piece of gear. They didn't actually create a pathway from the LFO to your amplifier, so then your LFO can't do anything with volume. It can only adjust certain parameters on the oscillator or on the filter, kind of whatever the manufacturer deemed, I guess, acceptable or necessary. But yeah, you can modulate anything. It's all based on the synth itself. So in SynthMaster, or essentially any other digital synthesizer, your LFO can modulate everything. It's kind of the point of it, is you're able to have a lot of control. But of course, if you're trying to create something that's a little bit more analog, modeling something from, say, a Juno or Jupiter or something like that, an actual physical synthesizer, you're going to have to go with the limitations of that synthesizer. So perhaps the synth that you're trying to that you're trying to replicate, perhaps that one doesn't allow you to have the LFO modulate the amplifier. Therefore, you shouldn't have SynthMaster do that. All right, so let's actually get into it. So I've got a stereo instrument track with SynthMaster on there already. Cool, we can hear that. So So right now we got a sawtooth wave. Let's go ahead and just build up a nice little patch. So I'm going to go ahead and just go real quickly through this because we've done this all before. I'll get a nice square wave for oscillator 1. And let's stick with a sawtooth wave for oscillator 2. That's cool. Get a little bit of release time on there. Cool, that's fine. All right. Let's go ahead and have the fine tuning go out a little bit on the sawtooth wave, which is oscillator number 2. See how I kind of gave it that phasiness? That was kind of fun. I like that. Let's go ahead and turn on filter number 1, and we'll have that cutoff filter right there. Just a little bit of a resonation. Let's check our key track. Okay, maybe a little back off. You know, I kind of liked it on. We're going to keep it on for this one. Okay, so now let's get into the LFO. To make it a little bit more accessible for you, what we can do is we can right-click on the right side over here, change the global skin, and we'll make it be 120%. Oh, maybe that's what oh, there we are. So we can see it a little bit better. In fact, actually, why don't we just go to 140%? Make it nice and big for everybody. Excellent. Okay, cool. So here's our LFO. If you click on it, you get to start to change any parameters on your LFO. If you right-click it, then you can see which LFO you want to work with. See how it says LFO 1, no targets, etc. That means that the LFO is not modulating anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this LFO modulate any parameter in SynthMaster. And what that's going to do is that's going to go according to the, it's going to change that parameter based on all these settings down here, but also based on the shape of our LFO. So if you think about it, from left to right is time, right? But then up and down is amplitude or volume. So based on this shape, let's go have it modulate the cutoff filter. Our filter is on, so we know we could hear it. We just right-click on whatever parameter we want to modulate. So I'm going to right-click, add modulation, LFO. Let's go to LFO number 1. There we go. It pops up. Let's go ahead and turn it off real quick. You can right-click and say remove. What's kind of fun about SynthMaster is you can right-click on whatever you're going to modulate, like the cutoff filter. Go to LFO number 1, and it's going to automatically bring up LFO number 1. So it helps with the workflow just a little bit. So now, listen to this when I hold a single note out. Notice how it's modulating the cutoff filter based on the shape of this wave. So there's our sine wave. Let's see what happens if I click it and we go to our basic wave and we just do a square wave. That's essentially on-off, right? Now it's not being as audible because I need to turn the cutoff filter down. There we go. Now we can hear it. So that's kind of, each shape has its own like use, right? Here's triangle shape. Now here's our sawtooth. Right, that's a saw up. We can also do saw down. Ooh, I kind of like that. Let's stick with that for now. Now let's check out how we're modulating this. So when I assigned the cutoff filter to be modulated by the LFO, notice how it gets this kind of this pink area right here. You can adjust how far that's going to fluctuate. So right now, it's at the very top for my saw down, right? And then it gradually goes down. So see how it starts at the very top right here, the loudest or the, I guess, the highest part of the cutoff frequency. So if I change this, if I click it and I go up or down, see how I can change the depth of that? Now it starts there, but if I click it and drag down, now it starts there and then goes down from there. So sometimes that might not be very easy for you. So if you just click on it and then you can, on the right side over here, you can change that with this and see how you can also go on the left and right side of the main frequencies cutoff of the cutoff filter, right? So the cutoff knob is saying right here, that's where we're going to have our filter cutoff. but then we're going to go on the left side of that. Now here's the other side. So you can just think of it as positive, negative, right? You can kind of flip the effect and bring it into the positive or the negative by going to the negative side of the modulation. Now let's look at our parameters for this, right? So we've got our shape we like. Remember what was one of the first things that we are going to be modulating? Speed. So there's our speed. Now notice as I'm adjusting my speed here, you can see up on the top right here in the inspector, you can see how or what these fine settings are. So right now, look at it. It says it's at 19 hertz. We can go up to 20. But listen what happens when we go like to 100. Hear those overtones? There's this weird in the upper range. In fact, actually, let's get rid of that modulation and let's do that to our volume of, say, the whole entire layer. So right click, add modulation, LFO number 1. But see how it's not really doing anything? It's because I got to click it and then change. There we are. Or at the other side. Right? Now let's see what happens when we go. So that's at 20 hertz. Let's try with a sine wave, see what that does. See, now we're at 61 hertz for our LFO. It's making those non-harmonic tones that we just don't appreciate. So we're not going to be doing that. But let's go ahead and actually stay on the sine wave. It's kind of nice, but one thing we can do is we can actually sync it to our to Pro Tools. So right now we're at 120 BPM. If we sync it, and now we are on, how about eighth notes? That's cool. And then times 1, this is for our musical friends. Times 1 would just be straight time, but then if you do 1.5, that's like a dotted note, and divided by 3 would be your triplets. And what's great is you can actually change these. These are modulatable. So other things can modulate these. So let's stay on here. Okay. So now we're in sync with Pro Tools. So let's go ahead and we'll keep going. So then there's speed, right? It speeds at 100% because we're on eighth notes. But if I do volume down, notice how it makes my wave shape smaller. Therefore, it adjusts the depth of the actual effect. Look how much the pink is changing. Up and down. So you can have it just minutely change it or drastically change it. And of course, phase just changes where that will be. Now, if you're right here and we're in time with the music, let's see what happens actually. Cool. Let's go ahead and quantize that. So I'll just option 0, highlight it. We'll do note on, note off at eighth notes, apply, done. That's funny. Why didn't it do these ones? Okay, now we can loop that selection. That's fine, but what if we had the phase start right at the top so that it's at its peak amplitude? It's actually more in time, so it's kind of nice to be able to change the phase of your waves right there. Now you can also introduce noise, which is a fun synth-master thing, of course. What's it replicating? Analog, right? add some sporadicness in there that's just kind of a little noisy, but it's still following the basic shape, but it can add to the analog tone. All right, so now right away when I hit some notes, it comes in right away, but watch when I put this at a 1 second delay. So that's 20 seconds delay. Let's go right. That was a 2 second delay. It took 2 seconds for it to turn on. So watch down here where I'm modulating. Nothing. And then it starts after 2 minutes. I like that. The delay is cool. It's fun. But then attack is probably more useful. The attack will mean that it slowly introduces the LFO. So over like a huge attack, you'll see it just barely modulate, and then as time goes on, it does more and more and more. Which is kind of fun. Release, of course, doing the same, just for typical release. Now, the final, this is just like the final volume. Oh, maybe because we're in sync right now. I never really mess with final. Now, SH, that's kind of like your sample rate in a weird little way. See how you can, when you quantize it, it makes the bits very ridiculous. Kind of fun. Very, very, very analog. Now, gate is pretty darn self-explanatory. Well, let's actually make our, there we go. Yeah, we'll turn the noise down so it's easy. I just gated it. So it's kind of a way of controlling your shape in an extremely analog way. There's lots of fun ways to digitally control your shapes, but I kind of like to use like gates or anything that are going to be a little bit more analog, so you get that tonality or functionality from older units, which we're all used to. Tone, I'm not really messing with that too much. Timbre anyway. Bits, how many bits are we assigning to it? So to see how it doesn't, it's kind of like sample rate, except for it maintains the shape, but it makes those steps a lot more drastic or blocky when you go down in bits. That's kind of cool. All right. So those are our basic parameters for an LFO. Now, the fun thing about LFOs is that you can modulate anything. The main parameters that you're going to be dealing with an LFO would be the speed of it, which would be rate, the volume, which would be depth, and then the wave shape, which would be sine wave or triangle or square or whatever. Let's go back to sine. Oh, we just have a gate on. There we go. That's kind of fun. So now let's see what else we can modulate. So let's go ahead and remove modulation there. So a big thing that people like to do is modulate the cutoff frequency. Right click, cutoff frequency, LFO1. Now we can set that depth to be quite low on here. Now we can do something even more fun. Let's turn on filter number 2, go to filter number 2, and let's do the exact same thing where we have this filter moving up and down with a good resonation. That'd be fun. But let's assign that to modulator number 2. So now we have filter 1 doing this, while filter 2 with a really slow speed. That's cool, right? So we got 2 different filters going right there. And you know, while I'm here, we're modulating the fine tune of this sawtooth wave. What if we just actually right click, modulate, LFO? Let's do that for LFO number 2 because it's going nice and slow. But man, that's a lot of modulation. See how it goes all the way? We just want barely any. So I'm just going to shorten it right here. So instead of shortening the depth or the volume on the actual LFO, I'm going to shorten it or control it on the receiving end. That's kind of cool. Now, notice I have fine tune already being modulated by LFO number 2, which is going at a much slower rate than right click LFO number 1, which is going at a very quick rate, which is in sync with us, right? LFO number 2 is not in sync, right? So just because LFO 2 is modulating fine tune, that doesn't mean I can't have it also be modulated by LFO number 1. So right click, add modulation, LFO number 1. So now it's being modulated twice. Let's have this go on the negative side. So fine tune is going to be pushing and pulling against itself, and it creates a very interesting. That's kind of fun. Now, automatically, I think we need some reverb here before we get into it. So I'm going to right click, add some reverb to it, kind of soften it up. I have to go to the effects tab now. Ooh, that's fun when I did that. So what if I right click on the mix of my reverb and have that be modulated by, say, LFO number 2, just a little bit. I can do it over here to up or down, right? See, it changes the depth of the effect over here. Well, that's fine right there. Isn't that rad that you can actually modulate your effects, which is that's a huge reason why you actually want your effects inside of your synthesizer as opposed to outside of your synthesizer. Rad. Now, I'm getting way too many high frequencies, so I'm just going to turn the cutoff filter generally down. Yeah, there we go. Let's go and turn our release time. That's pretty. I like that a lot. Very fun. Lots that you can do with the LFO. So now let's get into some more advanced features of the LFO. I'm sorry, not really advanced, but something that is worth noting because it's to go along with our discussion about how you create a performance that the synthesizer then interprets and then repeats back to you, and then that's going to change your performance. So it's this nice feedback loop, just in the same sense that you might be playing with another guitarist or keyboardist. Your synthesizer is essentially collaborating with you. So we have to make sure that we tell our synth how to operate appropriately. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and turn the effect off for now. So I just went to the tab and clicked that button to turn it off or on, because I want to be able to emulate this for you, or I want you guys to be able to see how this works. So what I'm going to do is, to really simplify it, I'm going to initialize the patch. Let's go to our sine wave to keep it easy. Yeah, we'll cut. Very fun. All right, now let's use our cutoff filter. So turn it on, right click, add modulation, LFO number 1. So now I'm in polyphonic mode at the moment, right? So that means I'm going to have more than one note playing at a single time. 2 or more is polyphony, right? So I'm hitting one note right now. And then, see how it's cycling, right? Now when I hit another one, right? See how they're kind of all going at this. Well, here, let's do a better one. So it's all operating independently compared to a monophonic mode. See how when I'm playing one note and then I play another, it doesn't restart from the beginning of our LFO. Let's go back to being in poly mode. See, anytime I add an additional note, it always goes back to the beginning and resets the LFO, which can be kind of jumpy. You might not want that, actually. So in monophonic mode, each time you hit a note, it restarts the LFO. But if you hold a note down and then play another note on top of it, it does not restart the LFO. That second note automatically joins in with the first one, which is of course dependent upon whatever kind of patch you're trying to create. If you were to make this in global mode, notice how I'm hitting note, and it seems like it's randomly choosing where it wants to start. So that one started right here. Now it started here. Now it started here. Now it started there, right? So it constantly is changing the starting point. But that's all based on the internal flow of this. So you can imagine that with global mode on, this LFO is constantly on. Just the second that you engage a note, it starts. So it's constantly on, and just whenever I hit a note, then all of a sudden, that's where you see it is. So it's kind of nice because then this is going to be just constantly going in the background, as opposed to just starting right when your note hits, which would be in monophonic mode or polyphonic mode. So they're all just they're all little settings that just want to, give you a little bit more of an option. Of course, older units, as they, started to modernize them or figure out how to put better parts in your synthesizers, we started including many different options. But before that, we were pretty much just in global or mono, and then we get to poly, and then now you have much more advanced parts. All right. I'm going to go back to polyphonic mode. Okay, so you can have your LFO modulate anything. If we want to go crazy with it, let's get really silly with it. LFO number 1 is modulating the cutoff, right? Now I'm also going to have LFO number 2 modulate up and down the resonation, so it's going to do that. So that one was modulation, or LFO 2. LFO 1 is just doing the cutoff filter, right? Yep. Okay, cool. Now I can do something really silly. What if I have LFO number 2? What if I have the speed of that LFO be changed depending on LFO number 1? So now I got to go back to LFO number 2, right? So now the speed of LFO2 is based on the speed of LFO1, which is constantly changing. Or it's not constantly changing, but it's constantly changing the shape, right? So that's why you get this weirdness happening up here. You can do all sorts of weird stuff with this. Let's have it change our phase too with LFO number 1. Yeah, you can do all sorts of weirdness with it. Okay, well, have fun with your LFO, just knowing that you can modulate anything, literally anything. I'll just do this for the last portion, LFO number 3. Let's make that be a square wave, though. Maybe if we add some reverb to that, it'll actually sound good. Very fun. All right. Happy tuning.